All right, let me find my clicker. So the first thing we want to ask, if you want to, go ahead and open your Bibles up to Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11. And before we get into new material, I like to see if there is any questions about the material we covered this morning. So anything from Mark chapter 11, verses 1 through 11 that you would want some further explanation on or had a question about or anything like that. If you don't, it's okay, but if you do, now is your time to ask something. I'm waiting till it's awkward. Okay, we got one. All right, Bert, yes, verse 11.
Jesus went into the temple in verse 11.
Yep.
He just looked around and he walked.
Yes. Okay, so verse 11, it does seem to be, so as we mentioned, there is like all of this buildup, all of this climax, and you think, even reading the Old Testament passages, that when he gets into the temple, like something's going to happen, right? Maybe they're going to shoot off fireworks, or that there's going to be some type of sign from God, or something along those lines. But it's very anticlimactic that he, in verse 11, and Jesus went into Jerusalem and into the temple, and so when he had looked around at all the things, as the hour was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Why do you think he did that? I mean, why all this stuff happening just to walk in and go, yeah, look at the time. I'll be back tomorrow. Right? What's going on here in your mind? I don't think, there might be some wrong answers, but I don't know if there's an actual right answer. Yes?
We don't know how long it took him to look around. He may have studied things for a while.
Yep. We definitely do not know the time frame as far as how long he looked around at things, that he, some commentators look at it like this, that he's almost like he's casing the joint. Okay? So he's preparing for what's going to happen tomorrow. And what happens tomorrow, those of you that have read along? All right, he cleanses the temple, right? Or he turns over the tables. So maybe he comes in that evening, looks around and goes, yeah, that table's going to have to move. And this is going to have to be done, or whatever. Some other options are, if it's already late, then it already being late, then most people are going to be where? They're gone. And if he's coming in, and part of the purpose of him coming in right now is to solidify himself and to show himself as who he is, he wants as many eyes on the situation as possible. Remember, earlier on in his ministry, it's not that he was afraid, but earlier on in his ministry, not to cause the confusion, he told people after he healed them, and they even said that, you must be the Messiah. What did Jesus tell them? Hey, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. Now he's coming in, and it seems to be that he wants more eyes on him, which is going to hasten his death. Okay? And he has a time frame to how all of this is going to work, about when he is going to be glorified, when he is going to die, and he is setting that time frame in motion right here. But I do think it's interesting that he comes on the scene in verse 11 and then just kind of basically walks back to Bethany. And Bethany is about a 2-mile walk from Jerusalem to Bethany. Any other questions or comments about the first verse? Yes, Mark.
I was going to ask kind of a broad question, but his entry and how the Jews were looking at him, talking about Hosanna, Hosanna, and looking at he's going to be their king, their kind of the earthly king is how they were looking.
Right.
And it seems to me like he talked about it, he addressed it, but he never specifically came out and told them, no, you got it all wrong. This is what I'm talking
Yeah, I would think that, so the question is that Mark asked, Jesus obviously knew he wasn't going to be an earthly king. He never had that plan to be an earthly king. Why doesn't Jesus have some clear teaching that he is not going to be that earthly king to those individuals? I think we can look at two different ways. Way number one is he does have clear teaching to his disciples. He lets his disciples know, and that might fall underneath the same thing as the parables, right? The parables were meant for some people to cause confusion, for them not to understand, and for other people, for them to understand. It was a two-edged sword. So I think that part of the reason is that he came and told his disciples exactly what was happening, and when his disciples were told exactly what was happening, did they understand it? No. They're dense. They don't get it. Now, there's some people who maybe in that greater group of his disciples that eventually do understand it. I think it's very interesting, like you think about the quote-unquote thief on the cross, right? Of all the people, the thief on the cross seems to understand it more than even the disciples understand it. Because remember, the thief on the cross said, remember me when? When you come into your kingdom, and the dude's hanging on a cross. You're not going into a kingdom on earth if you're hanging on a cross. And so he obviously figured something out. But I don't know, obviously, it's going to be conjecture, right? I don't know why he doesn't say a certain thing a certain way. But I do think that he did say some things, but at the same time, it's like the proverbial statement, you can lead a horse to water. And he has led them to it, but they got to decide whether they're going to drink or not. And then also they have all of this stuff, all of this history, hundreds of years of history and interpretation of the Old Testament texts that have led them to think of what the Messiah has to look like. And when he doesn't meet that stuff, they're just going to reject it because that's not what it's supposed to be. And that's why the Jews to this day, in many ways, reject Jesus as the Messiah, because they don't see those different connections there. And of course, the New Testament also opens up different connections that you wouldn't necessarily get just by reading the Old Testament without the New Testament. You would never expect the Messiah to suffer and die, but the New Testament plays in that the Messiah is also the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. But Isaiah 53 never mentions the word Messiah at all. But the New Testament makes that connection, and Jesus makes that connection also. Okay, well, let's look at, in the 25-ish minutes that we have, let's look at the poor fig tree. Okay, that's what I want to focus in on this evening. We're going to start in verse 12, okay, and we're going to read verses 12 through 26. It's a lengthy reading, but pay attention, and we'll see how much we can get covered tonight. Now the next day, so this is right after his entry, he had gone back to Bethany. Now he's headed back there. He says, when they had come out from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing from afar a fig tree having leaves, he went to see if perhaps he would find something on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves. Then a parenthetical statement from Mark, for it was not the season for figs. In response, Jesus said to it, let no one eat fruit from you ever again. Another parenthetical statement, and his disciples heard what he has said. Verse 15, so they came to Jerusalem. Then Jesus went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry wares through the temple. Then he taught, saying to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of thieves? And the scribes and the chief priests heard it, and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his teaching. When the evening had come, he went out of the city. Now in the morning, this is the next morning, so if we're doing it chronological, we're talking about Tuesday morning now. Now in the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree, this fig tree being that same fig tree that was cursed, dried up from the roots. And Peter, remembering, said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered away. So Jesus answered and said to them, have faith in God, for assuredly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be removed and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that those things he says will be done, he will have whatever he says. Therefore I say to you, whatever things you ask, when you pray, believe that you receive them, and you will have them. And whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, that your Father in heaven may also forgive your trespasses. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father in heaven forgive your trespasses. Okay? That's the entire section. We'll see how much we can talk about it. Okay, the first thing I want to ask is those of you that remember, what literary feature is Mark using in this section? We had a special name for it. All right, a story sandwich or a Mark sandwich. Very good. Make sure you get your gold star after services, okay? A story sandwich, a Markan sandwich. The technical name is intercalation, okay? This is Mark using two stories that seemingly have nothing to do with each other, and he sandwiches them together to show a point. So if we could take out that entire section about cleansing the temple, and we could stop there in verse 14 and then jump back over in verse 20, and we'd have a full story. But by placing the cleansing of the temple in between it, what Mark is saying is these things are connected. The cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple, you're supposed to look at them in relationship to each other. And we look at them in relationship to each other, it deepens the meaning of both of the situations. Okay? So that is what Mark is trying to do here. So let's ask this question then. Why does Jesus curse the fig tree? What did that fig tree do to anybody? Right? It's not bearing fruit. But Terry, why would it bear fruit? It's not even the time for fruit. It's like going up to an apple tree when it's not apple season and going, you don't have any apples and now I'm going to curse you. So why does he, I agree he's not bearing fruit, but why does he curse this fig tree? Yes, Ron.
Ties in very well with the sin.
Okay.
The worship place and the Pharisees that were operating the temple put forth a good show.
Mm-hmm.
And they showed their religiosity, if there is such a word.
Yes.
And they had no substance, they had no fruit. Fig tree provides a perfect example of that very. These high priests and priests were getting rich
Mm-hmm.
off of the people. Sorry, I'm not trying to teach you this.
No, I agree. No.
They were getting rich off the people because they would decline their offerings and then go and sell them to somebody else. And they were making money.
There seems to be, we'll talk about this more when we get to the temple part, there definitely seems to be corruption that is going on in the temple. But what we see here is the fig tree becomes a picture, like Ron said, of what the temple, what was taking place there. Jesus sees a fig tree, and he sees the fig tree, and what's the fig tree's job? What's it supposed to do? Produce fruit, produce figs. So when I am hungry, when I am in need, I can go to said fig tree and get said fruit. Then he also looks off in the distance, and he sees the temple. The temple has a purpose. It has a job. He looks at it and he looks at all the things that are going on. It looks like a working temple. There's people going in and out. There's people who are going about making sure they pay their temple tax. There's people that are getting the doves that they need. Now, it highlights doves. What's the significance of doves in the temple? Who are the doves for? Doves are for the poor people, okay? if you are supposed to offer sacrifices dependent upon your economic scale, your level. If you have enough money, you give a red heifer, okay? You give a whole cow when you come in. If you're poor, you give turtle doves. Interestingly enough, when the sacrifice is made for Jesus' birth, what does his mother Mary bring? Doves, because she's poor, okay? She has not come from wealth. But you see all of this taking place, and you would think that it would be producing fruit. But guess what? It's not. It's not producing fruit. And a fig tree that is not doing its job, what needs to happen to it? It can be pruned. It can be done away with. Jesus evidently decides that instead of pruning it, instead of fertilizing it, that he is just going to be done with it. What about the temple? Is he going to come in and prune the temple? Well, he cleanses it, but at the same time, what I think this is more pointing to is saying, Jesus is saying that this temple is no longer serving its purpose, and I am going to have it destroyed. And it eventually is destroyed. It's not destroyed right then, but it's destroyed in AD 70, and there is other teaching later on in Mark and also in the other Gospels about that destruction of the temple, okay? So he curses this fig tree, and he does it for the purpose of thinking about what's going to happen in just a moment when he goes into the temple. Something else, there's other passages too. We don't have time to look at them tonight, but if you want to write this down, Jeremiah in chapter 8 and verse 13, and also in Hosea 9, 10, and then 16 and 17, there it refers to the fig tree as being a model of Israel's faithfulness. And there's a whole section about the tree having good figs and bad figs and talking about Israel and their faithfulness. And so Jesus is not coming up with something new when he curses this fig tree. Of course, fig trees were prevalent in the area, so if you're going to use an illustration, you might as well use an illustration people are familiar with. It'd be odd if, he did an illustration with corn, right? When they don't grow corn there. So that's the reason why he's also using this fig tree. All right, let's ask this question then. Why does Jesus cleanse the temple? And I put cleanse in scare quotes there because Mark does not use the idea, it does not say cleanse, although my heading, which is obviously not the Lord's writing or whatever, my heading says Jesus cleanses the temple. But why does he do this? Okay, it had been made into a den of thieves, and that may be inferring that people were taking advantage of people, and perhaps especially the poor were being taken advantage of. Why else? Yes, Neil.
He said earlier, the time's coming that you won't come to this mountain of Jerusalem. You'll worship in spirit and in truth.
Definitely. So in connection in John chapter 4 and talking to the woman at the well, he is at least hinting to the fact that there will come a time that the temple is no longer going to be there, but you're going to worship not at this temple, but actually you're going to worship in your heart, which of course Paul would later on say that you are the temple, you yourselves, the church and the individual. But definitely with that, yes?
Well, the beginning of that verse 17, he said, going back to Old Testament scripture, my house will be a house of prayer.
Definitely so. So he is quoting from, a couple of places that he's quoting from is Isaiah chapter 56, and in verse 7, that the temple was supposed to be a house of prayer, and a house of prayer for who? All nations. Not just the Jews, but also for the Gentiles. It's supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, but he has made it into a den of thieves, and that's pulling from Jeremiah in chapter 7 and in verse 11, where that entire oracle is talking against the temple and how that it is not doing what it's supposed to do. What I want you to see, though, is perhaps one of the reasons why, or perhaps the overall reason why he is cleansing the temple. Yes, he has trouble with people taking advantage of people and all of those things. But what Jesus is doing here is he is acting as an Old Testament prophet. Okay? Old Testament prophets did some weird stuff. They would lay on their side for days at a time. They would walk around naked at one point. They would have to go and marry a prostitute. There was all kinds of things that these Old Testament prophets would do to try to be an illustration about what's going to take place. When Jesus comes in and basically he turns over the money changer's table, he stops people from going about their business. No, you can't come in here. No, you can't take that out. He is causing a scene that people are going to look at. And in fact, some people look at it and see his teaching and they are what by it? Astonished. They're impressed by it. Some other people see him and what he is doing, and what is their reaction? They are fearful and they want to destroy him. It brings up the same thing that happens with anybody when they approach Jesus. When you approach Jesus, C.S. Lewis wasn't the first person to say it, but he made it famous that he's either going to be a liar, a lunatic, or a lord, right? And they see him right now as a lunatic, and they want to destroy him. Other people are seeing him as the Lord, as the Messiah, and are astonished at his teaching. But what also he does when he has cleansed the temple, he's going to come back in, and we're not going to get to it tonight, but in verse 27, he goes back into the temple again, okay? And as he was walking in the temple. Now, as he walks in, do you think that there's no more money changers and no more tables? What do you think happened the very next day? They set it all back up. So why doesn't Jesus go, I told y'all not to have all of this stuff. Why doesn't he cleanse it again? He made his point. He made his point. His point is that this temple is not going to last forever. It was supposed to be one thing, and it is not fulfilling that purpose. And just like that fig tree that is withered up, this also is going to be withered up. It's going to be done away with. Now, just like a good Old Testament prophet, he is showing this, and it's not going to happen immediately necessarily. Sometimes it happens years and years later, and this more likely happens about 40 years later from where they are. Yes, Tim.
So he's made his point here, because in John 2, he cleanses the temple. Is this a second cleansing, or is John recording the history out of order?
We are stepping into the age-old question of the temple cleansing. Okay, so there is a couple different ways to look at it. There are some people that look at Scripture, I think, and try to place upon it 21st century restrictions, like it's a history, like it has to flow in order and it has to be in a chronological order. The way I think the Gospels are written is it's trying to get across a message. And in getting across that message, they sometimes put things in different sets of orders. So this is just my opinion. There's other people that are much smarter than me that have different opinion. And there are other people who are much smarter than me that have the same opinion. I like those people more than the other people. But that John 2 places the temple cleansing there. But in my opinion, John puts that there not in chronological order, but for a theological point. That he is trying to prove that he is the new temple. Okay? There's all kinds of other things that are going on in John 2 also. When you think about the beginning of his ministry and the wedding feast and the providing of the better wine and how that is a kingdom promise and all of these things. And so, in my opinion, there was probably only one temple cleansing that happened in the Passion Week, the last week of Jesus' life, on that Monday. But John, for a theological purpose, is putting that information there. Which we'll notice in just a minute that Mark put some information about prayer right here, which I'm not saying Jesus didn't say. I think Jesus definitely said it. Did he say it right here in this connection or not? I'm not sure, but Mark wants to put it in this connection to make a point. And so sometimes we read the Gospels like we're trying to read a history book. The Gospels aren't a history book. Do they tell history? Yes. Is it true history? Yes. But remember, their point is to show you Jesus as the Messiah. That's their point. And they go about that in different ways. John does it totally different than the other Gospels. But in my opinion, Tim, that cleansing is there for a theological point and not necessarily a chronological order, which all the synoptics together have just one temple cleansing at the end of his ministry versus the beginning. And you're welcome to disagree with me about that, okay? Just not right now. Any other, yes, let's go Josh and then Terry.
I think part of this point of why he cleanses the temple is that the whole story sandwich is talking about how prayer has to be faithful.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus curses the tree. Later when we pick up the second part of the sandwich, his disciples are surprised. Jesus says you have to pray with faith. And then this is also echoed in James 1. You know, you have to pray expecting.
Without doubting, yep.
And then the middle part, the cleansing of the temple, it's like he's trying to correct the prayer that's happening there. That's a main point of why people go to the temple. It's not about did you buy your sacrifice from the right person, and you shouldn't be worried about that. And it's not about people controlling you. The temple is your connection to God in that time. Now we have to move beyond that, and he has to tell you, it's just it seems to be such an important point, but we don't necessarily think of it like that today. But your prayer has to be faithfully offered.
Definitely so. And I think that the idea of prayer he's going to bring up is there for a reason, and some of those reasons that Josh just touched on there. Terry?
Yes, I have 2 points.
Sure.
I noticed that Christ also cast out the people who were there to worship as well. Cast them out too.
Yep.
Which to me kind of amazing. Not only the money changers and those who were seating people, also those who were there to buy, cast them out too.
Yep.
And the second thing, can we also relate this to the book of Revelation where Christ had problems with the church? They were lukewarm or not doing things, not pleasing him in a way that he wanted them to. For us today, is that same message. The church can be in the same way, not being what God would have it to be as well. It's almost like a warning to us as well that we need to be aware and alert to make sure we're doing what we need to be doing at church.
Definitely so. So your second point, definitely so. This can be a warning for us that if we do not fulfill our purposes, then God has no need for us in that aspect. Same thing is true with the 7 churches of Asia Minor that you referred to in Revelation and in chapter 3 and 4, that they could, their candlestick could be removed, if you will. Back to your first point, I think it is interesting, as it said there in verse 15, that he goes into the temple and he drives out those who bought and sold in the temple. So, yes, there may have been some nefarious things going on with those that are selling, but he's also driving out just the everyday worshiper that is coming in. And so I think the point is that he is trying to make is saying, this is all fruitless. All these things that you are doing, it looks like a fig tree that has fruit because of all these leaves we see, but it's fruitless. It's vain, and I'm going to put an end to it. And eventually, Jesus does put an end to it as far as the AD 70 when the temple is completely destroyed. So let's get to the other thing that Josh brought up about prayer. Why does Mark connect Jesus' teaching on prayer here? Notice that the point of the temple that Jesus brings out in verse 17 is what? What was this house supposed to be used for? It was supposed to be a house of prayer. So if he removes the house of prayer, how are people supposed to pray now? With what? With faith? Going through who? Jesus. You know, sometimes, well, every single time that we have a prayer, how do we end our prayers? In Jesus' name. And of course, some of that connection is that there is only one mediator between God and man, Jesus the Son, right? But in another concept is that Jesus is our house of prayer. He is the house of prayer for all the nations. And when I pray, I go through the house of prayer, the temple being Jesus. Jesus was very, very clear that he is going to tear down this temple in 3 days. He's going to rebuild it. And the people are like, oh, what do you mean you're going to do that? It took so many years to do all those things. How in this? He was talking about his body, right? He was talking about himself. And that was in the connection in John chapter 2 after he cleanses the temple there in John 2. But what I want you to see is that we still have a temple. It's not a physical structure. It's not this church building. This church building, yes, definitely should be a place where prayer takes place. But you, with a faithful heart, can go to God through Jesus Christ. And he is the house of prayer for you, and he's the house of prayer for all nations, and your intercessor today. Neil, did you have a question?
I was just going to say, at his death, the veil of the temple was torn in two, which was separating us from God.
Definitely so. So the veil is torn in two, and that's actually brought up in Mark 15. It is torn in two and allowing us that access. One of my favorite passages over in Hebrews, and in chapter 4, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus Christ, the Son, that we can come boldly before the throne, right? Not timidly, we can boldly come before the throne because of Jesus allowing us that access. And that is possible today. And that is one of the things, I think, one of the things that we are seeing from this cleansing of the temple. Yes, Tarsha.
It reminded me of Malachi 1, and we studied this in the Ladies' Gospel a while back, but in verse 10, it just kind of goes back to that, the temple being defiled, and it says, oh, that one of you would just shut the temple doors, so
Yeah.
you would no longer kindle useless fires on my altar. So it's God then being disgusted with them in the way that they were coming to the temple and offering, and he just said, the prophet was saying, I wish somebody would just close the doors, because I don't even want this.
Definitely so. And Malachi does that. Also, Isaiah does that. And Jesus is further teaching those things too, and trying to show that there is going to be a change. There is going to be a change in regime. And of course, the ones who have the most control over the temple are the scribes and the chief priests. A lot of times we clump in the Pharisees with them. The Pharisees also were an enemy of Jesus in many ways, but there are two different groups. The Pharisees usually didn't have much control, if any, over the temple structure. They had more control over the synagogues and things like that. But the chief priests and the scribes, who have more control over the temple area, and even the Herodians have control over it too, they want to find a way to destroy him. And that just plays in off of what Jesus said was going to happen to him as the Messiah, that these chief priests and scribes were going to take him and kill him, right? And that all plays all back in together. Any other closing comments? Just think about this last thing. So what are we supposed to learn from all of this? A couple of things I think you can take home from this. Number one, to realize that you do not want to be the poor fig tree. Don't be the fig tree. Don't have the appearance that you are bringing forth fruit and then found to be fruitless. But instead, let's have the appearance that we're bringing forth fruit and what? And bring the fruit. Let's do both. And I think the other big thing that we learn from this is that Jesus is showing that he is going to be all that we need. He fits all the boxes. He checks all the places, right? In the Old Testament, they needed a temple, and they needed a priest, and they needed a sacrifice, and they needed this. In our system, we have Jesus. And he's the temple. And he's the sacrifice. And he's the priest. He gets it all. So why should I look anywhere else? And so focus in on that too. All right, We will have more of these discussions at another time. I am trying to do better to stay on time with these classes on Sunday night. So what we're going to do now is we're going to enter into a time of worship in song and in prayer in this house of worship, not because of the structure of the walls, but because of each and every one of us that make up what is the temple of the living God today through Jesus, our high priest. So we'll turn things over to those leading singing.